Good morning and welcome back to CNAS's annual National Security Conference. I'm Richard Fontaine, the Chief Executive Officer of CNAS. Our first panel today is Protecting Democracy, Protecting National Security. It'll be moderated by Axios National Political Correspondent and Jonathan Swan, and it'll feature Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin, Congressman Peter Meijer, and CNAS Senior Fellow Carrie Cordero. We'll start that in just a minute. Following the session, we'll have one on military recruitment for an era of competition, and then Russia, an assumptions check, America and the Middle East, and the Quad equation, how four democracies can uphold the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. For those of you who'd like to engage with the panelists, ask questions, make comments during the sessions, you can follow us on Twitter at CNASDC, tweet using the hashtag CNAS 2021. You can also join the conversation and submit questions by visiting the official conference website, conference.cnas.org or cnas.org/live. So with that, let's kick it off. And I will now turn it over to Jonathan Swan, who will moderate our opening panel. So thanks, Jonathan, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Richard. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. This session is going to be focused on Homeland security oversight and the intersection of national security and bolstering US democracy. We've got a fabulous panel. Democratic Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin. She represents Michigan's 8th Congressional District. She's a former CIA officer, served multiple tours in Iraq, and she held senior defense and intelligence positions during the Bush and Obama administrations. We've also got Republican Congressman Peter Meijer. He represents Michigan's 3rd Congressional District. He's an Iraq veteran who went on to serve veterans and lead an NGO in Afghanistan that provided emergency assistance to aid workers after kidnappings and targeted killings. And of course, we have Carrie Cordero, and she's one of the country's most respected counterterrorism and counterintelligence experts. She has deep experience in government. She held senior national security roles at the Justice Department and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And she's now a Senior Fellow and General Counsel at CNAS. And I'm Jonathan Swan. I'm just a reporter. So I want to start by acknowledging an ugly reality, which is that domestic terrorism and political violence have penetrated the halls of Congress. Representative Liz Cheney says, and I interviewed her recently, she says that Republican members have confided in her that they would have voted to impeach Donald Trump after January 6th, but they decided not to out of fears for their personal safety. Congressman Meijer, as a Republican, you took that tough vote to impeach former President Trump. You've admitted publicly that this was probably political suicide, but have you worried, actually, I don't know a more delicate way to put this, that it's not just political danger that you find yourself in?
I mean, there's certainly a personal kind of risk element. I think the way I framed it was, I don't believe in the heckler's veto, and I also don't believe in the assassin's veto. I think you mentioned the fear around that vote. I had colleagues who expressed deep concern around just the vote to certify the election and whether that would put themselves or their families at risk. And to me, that is a clear danger sign of kind of where we are right now. If we have politicians who are making decisions and basing their votes, not necessarily based on their judgment, but based on real and tangible concerns. And that, again, that was before we were heading into this. That was before what we saw, the violence of the Capitol on the 6th.
I mean, to the extent that you're comfortable talking about it, I mean, how has your life in that respect changed since you took that vote?
A lot more looking over your shoulder. I mean, again, I have to frame it in the context of having spent 3 years between Iraq and Afghanistan, and in Iraq as a combatant, where I had a weapon and I could call up air support, and had that armored vehicles and all sorts of defensive abilities. Afghanistan, where I was a civilian, unarmed, living on the economy. So very, very different kind of night and day scenarios there. But I would say when it comes to now being in politics in Washington, having to be very aware. I mean, we saw the violence, the attack on the Republican members who were practicing for the congressional baseball team back in 2017. We saw the shooting of Gabrielle Giffords back in, I believe, 2010 or 2011. So, I mean, the violence has been there, but just obviously where we are today with kind of countering notions of reality, one, that the election was stolen and that the 6th was the day to stop that steal, and the other where it wasn't, and January 6th was a ministerial act of Congress to certify an election. And if you believe that the election was stolen and that this was an assault on our democratic systems that of an unprecedented scale, then what logically is justified based on that belief can lead to some pretty dark and scary terrain.
Congresswoman Slotkin, the Republican Party, I should stress, not Congressman Meijer, but the majority of the party has blocked the commission to investigate January 6th. Do you see any way to conduct a credible bipartisan investigation into what happened?
Well, I think that's what we're trying to parse through right now. It was a really disheartening moment to watch it fail in the Senate, particularly for those of us who's been in national security, and so much of our career has been shaped by the 9/11 Commission and then the WMD Commission, right? These are things that are sort of the luminaries of our time have put these together. And the 1/6 Commission was literally a cut and paste job from the 9/11 Commission. You can look at the mandate and it was a cut and paste. So we're trying to parse our way through it. I think it's important that we remember who the audience is. The audience for this, in my goal, is not inside the Beltway kind of members of Congress. It's the American public who all watch those events unfold on TV. Just like the 9/11 Commission turned into a paperback book that you could buy at any newsstand, they made graphic novels out of it, and the textbooks that our kids now read about 9/11 are based on that report. That's what I'm interested in. So it's important, if you're thinking about the audience, that it be bipartisan, even though that's hard. We have to figure out a way for this to not become a political clown show, and actually give it some sense of credibility, not inside the Beltway, but for the American people. And it's difficult.
Well, respectfully, it already is a political clown show. The question is how, at this point, now Republicans have blocked this commission, and you just described the framework. What happens now?
Yeah. So we did have a bipartisan group of senators who actually put out a pretty good report, literally just about the security side of what happened just this past week, which I thought was a good start. One of the options, frankly, both Representative Meijer and I are on the Homeland Security Committee. There is discussion of handing it over to our committee, since no one would get to name new committee members and wouldn't turn into maybe a political clown show even more maybe than it could be at this point. There are options to create, again, a bipartisan group, a special select committee, but there are all lesser options, that's for sure.
Right.
But
your committee's pretty good, though. I mean, in terms of bipartisanship, the Homeland Security Committee's quite good, isn't it, in the context of Congress?
Yeah, and it was our chairman and ranking member who drew up the provisions for the bill on the 1/6 Commission. So they're serious people, but there's a range of voices on our committee, as Peter knows. And I think that's good. That's the point, right? Is to not just stack the deck with people will give a good speech on camera, but actually put people in there who are representing the public and asking those tough questions.
Carrie, you and I have talked about this a little bit over the months. You're really worried about the rise of political violence in America. What, in your mind, needs to be done to address it?
So thanks, Jonathan, and thanks to both of the members for joining us for this conversation. So, Jonathan, I'm really worried about the fact that there are members, and I really do believe that there are, whose actually votes, whether it was on impeachment, whether it was on the January 6th Commission, or as Congressman Meijer says, whether it was on the actual vote to certify the election, whether their votes are being affected because they fear for their own safety, or they fear for the safety of their families. And the reason that is such a bad place for the country to be is that they are then impacted, or in some cases perhaps prevented from doing their constitutional duty. And so we really are at a place where if this isn't just one member, if this is multiple members who have credible fear, it is impacting the functioning of the country, the ability of the Constitution to actually work in a functional way. So there are some things that I think can be done about it, both in the short term and the longer term. Representative Slotkin mentioned the most recent Senate report that came out. So just this week, the Senate Homeland Committee and the Rules Committee issued a staff report that focused on some of the security issues related to January 6th. And General Honore had also done a very quick review that came out in March regarding some issues regarding the Capitol Police. I think the work that was done in those two reports, at least, can inform more work that needs to be done to improve the security of members. I know that Congress doesn't like to spend money on itself, but it really needs to take the security, the leadership needs to take the security of members really seriously and do more for the physical security of members, not just at the Capitol, but General Honore's report discussed how there is very spotty and inconsistent and ad hoc security provided for members when they are traveling and when they are at home in their districts. There's a lot of recommendations that are out there to improve the functioning of the Capitol Police. The Capitol Police at this point cannot just, be about monitoring visitors coming in. There is a really serious job that we see that they need to do, and the functioning of their board in particular. And I don't think that this issue has gotten enough import in either of the two reports that have come out so far. But a board cannot be operational. So they currently have a board that governs the Capitol Police, and that hampered some of the operational speed and efficiency leading up to and on January 6th. And so the functioning of that board and really making sure that the commander of the Capitol Police has operational control and on-scene command for a day that is important to the Capitol complex needs to be fixed. And then the third piece that I'll mention, Jonathan, is in the longer term. So those are some short-term things that I think need to be done to really take seriously the security and safety of members of Congress. In the longer term, the other way that I think the leadership has a responsibility is to have more accountability for members who are involved in inciting or encouraging, or even themselves being aggressive towards other members of Congress, because that their followers, their constituents, they see that behavior and those speeches. And so I think there does need to be a more of an accountability within the Congress itself for having some decorum, having civil discourse, and not accepting members of Congress, creating an environment that makes their colleagues unsafe.
I want to pull back a little bit. Both members of Congress on this Zoom come from Michigan. It's a state with a long and pretty sordid history of local militias, and it's become a bit of a poster for domestic extremism. Last year, law enforcement disrupted a right-wing extremist plot to kidnap your governor. Representative Slotkin, should we view Michigan as an aberration, or is it a sign of where things are heading, a bit of a canary in the coal mine? How do you see it?
Well, I do think that at least in the past year, Michigan has been kind of a harbinger of what's to come on the national scene. And, we had armed protesters force their way into our Capitol in April of 2020, a good 9 months before they came inside the Capitol. On the 6th of January, we have had a rise in militia groups. The raid that you're talking about that disrupted the plot against our governor was in my district. It has definitely been grappling with this, and we have somewhat of a history with it as well. I think that the important thing, though, is two things. One, this rise in all these things came from the normalization of hate. the normalization of threatening violence against political opponents. That was normalized over the past 4 years. So it's become commonplace. I mean, literally yesterday, they sentenced a man, to 2 years parole for threatening me in my office over and over again, and finally arrested him when he was brandishing his AR-15. Like, it's become sort of commonplace, but that doesn't mean it has to stay commonplace. And I think deterring people and showing people that we will act within the legal framework is extremely important for the next year. People need to see that I might lose my job. I might lose my, status in the community if I'm caught threatening violence. That has to be a red line in a diverse country. So I do think Michigan, we had our share of this, but we also, it just doesn't represent the average person in our state. The average person in our state does not talk like that, does not act like that. We're a swing state. We always have been. So it gives me hope that as we start to deter and set a red line on threatening violence, that we'll see some of that, calm down a bit.
Thank you. Congressman May, you and Congresswoman Slotkin are allies in trying to solve this problem across the aisle. You're both on the Homeland Security Committee, and you've both had the experience in Michigan, sort of ground zero of some of this stuff. What are some of the practical, specific things that you can do in your committee work to address domestic extremism, both at the federal level and in your own communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the important things is making sure we don't forget the word violent, because the extremist label gets thrown around. Where it trips from and where those First Amendment protections run out is when somebody engages in or prepares to engage in an act of violence. I have a lot of people will come up and say, you're targeting me, you're stigmatizing me, you're calling me a terrorist. And I'm like, when we say violent, are you planning to engage in violent activities? Are you preparing to take up arms against the government? Is that what you're trying to do? Or they go, no. I'm like, then you don't have any, I'm not talking about you. I mean, one of the challenges in our rhetorical environment is everything gets painted with such a broad brush that it, on the right, we use socialism so much as a cudgel going back years than when a policy is legitimately socialist or someone claiming themselves, that's lost all value. On the left, white supremacy has taken on that same valence, where we talk in such broad brush terms that we lose the ability to specifically say what we're doing. And I think to Elissa's point, talking on these issues of making sure we're being very clear on the violence, making sure that we are protecting constitutional rights and we are respecting the difference between somebody who is airing a constitutionally protected opinion versus those who are planning or conspiring to engage in violent activity is essential. But a lot of this really has to get down at the local level as well. And this is something that we saw with the rise of Islamic extremism as well. How can you nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens in isolation. You look at the reports of a lot of the individuals who were arrested for attacking law enforcement at the Capitol. This did not come out of nowhere. There were signs of individuals who were making themselves more prone to being radicalized, who were going down dangerous paths. So how do we have in the community the ability to try to get people back together? I mean, that was, I think, one of the reasons why we saw both the eruption of violence over the summer and the attack on the Capitol. The social isolation and alienation and pressure of a pandemic society has had that impact, right? People start to go crazy when they're removed from other people. And those neighbors, those family members, the people who go to church with you, I mean, those are going to be that first line of trying to get someone back. That local law enforcement can hopefully identify and talk with and sit down and have an honest conversation with somebody before they get to the point of wanting to take up arms and engage in a violent act. So the more we can begin to localize some of these issues is critical, while at the same time, and this is where Elissa and I have been talking with federal authorities, where are current statutes inadequate and how can we modify them in a way that still respects constitutional rights? Because dealing with violent extremism at home, there may be some parallels to international extremism, but there are still very concrete night and day differences that we need to never forget.
Well, you just raised a whole bunch of really interesting and complicated issues in what you just said. I want to pick out a few of them. So the first is the question of violence. So, okay, everyone understands when someone starts ranting, I'm going to shoot up a school, that's a moment for intervention. But as you acknowledged later in your answer, there's a ladder, there's an escalatory ladder. It might start with someone going down a wormhole on YouTube, watching Jewish conspiracy videos, and then they start watching more, unsavory content, getting more and more radicalized, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a question about intervention. And I wonder, firstly, for you, Congressman Meijer, there's obviously, you raised the issue of civil liberties and constitutional rights, and there are really real things to balance there. But, if I'm a impressionable young man and I'm on YouTube and I've watched my fifth, the Jews are terrible, evil people, or whatever bigoted Muslim video, my fifth one in a row, should I have some kind of, should there be an intervention on the sixth video? How do we, what is the intervention there for, is there a government role? Is it a social media company role? Or is this just, going down a path that you don't approve of?
I mean, my vast preference is for that, your neighbor is going to have your family member is going to have a much better idea. Are you watching those?
They might not know. They might have no idea. You might be doing incognito or whatever.
Let me frame it this way. That person close to you, and as somebody who has been pulled into the little back room at JFK flying back from Afghanistan because it showed I had a one-way ticket, I had very good reasons to be there as somebody who was working and had business cards and all this, but, lumped in that same. I do not trust necessarily our federal apparatus to be able to distinguish between the grad student writing a dissertation topic on anti-Semitism who's watching those videos, and a kid who's got, a swastika painted on the wall and is, obsessed with atom waffen division, right? We need to be making sure that we are doing so in a way that is being thoughtful above all else. And on that point, this is where leaders have a responsibility, and I'm getting a little bit away from the question, but leaders have a responsibility to be setting that overall framework, right? To not be creating the permission structure that kind of winks and nods and rides right up to a line. It maybe doesn't cross it, so they can say they didn't cross it, but the people on the other side of that line look at it not approvingly and feel like they have a fellow traveler, right? That is where the leadership responsibility should be at a community level. And we've seen this in some, especially in the Arab community in Michigan. It's been incredibly helpful to have trusting relationships with law enforcement, that it's not that you don't have to wait until something goes so far that it's beyond salvation, right? That it's beyond redemption. At the same time, that tip or that alert doesn't result in the cuffs immediately coming on and somebody getting removed from the community when it hasn't gone that far. There's a very fine balance that I think in dealing with Islamic extremism, our federal government has gone, in that post 9/11 era, the cuffs came on very quickly, and there were some demonstrable abuses. In later iterations, there were better information sharing from the local level on up, and this is where a lot of our conversations have been focused. Oftentimes, that isolated incident where somebody may get arrested for something and it's suspicious, but it's not crazy. There may be another breadcrumb that the federal government is aware of, not being connected. I think that connective tissue is important, but also having local input to be able to offer those atmospherics and those characterizations so that it's not a black or white distinction, but something where we recognize we're in a gray area.
But here's the problem with what you're saying, and I want to get Congresswoman Slotkin's views on this, is yes, absolutely. There's a role for civil society, a very important role in community leaders, et cetera. And you raised the example of the post 9/11 environment where law enforcement, yes, there were abuses, but they also in some instances worked very effectively with Muslim leaders to, if someone's going down the wrong path, to intervene early. Congresswoman Slotkin, when we're talking about right-wing white supremacists, you don't just call up the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. Who do you deal with? It's a really serious question. When you don't, it's not like these people are going to church necessarily or actually engage. It's an atomized society. They're in these disgusting little rabbit holes with really foul people. And how do you actually penetrate that? If you get a call, Congresswoman Slotkin, from a mother in your district saying, I'm at my wit's end, my son is anti-Semitic or he's Islamophobic, he's ranting about this, he's not saying anything violent, who do I call? Who do they call?
Yeah. So there are actually, they're a very small scale, but there are organizations around the country who do this, who basically do, I don't know what to call it, deprogramming of people who are off on the wrong track. And what I think the Department of Homeland Security has already announced is that they're going to put in $40 million to sort of supercharging these organizations, expanding them, helping other nonprofits who do look at communities where you have a disproportionate problem on this issue. And it's not perfect. Anyone who was working in the post 9/11 era will tell you we never really, this is a very complicated problem and we were not perfect at it, right? At all.
Right.
But you got to try where you have, so there are nonprofit organizations that do this and they're about to get significantly more funding. And I will say, I'm the chairwoman of the Intel and Counterterrorism Committee, the committee that Peter's on and that we focusing on domestic terrorism. And we are trying to learn the lessons of the post 9/11 era, both good and bad, when we look at whether we're right-sized on domestic terrorism, right? We responded emotionally to 9/11, and God knows I did. I was in New York City on 9/11, like we had been attacked. But when you think about what we did to respond, some of it was great. And if you would have asked me 20 years ago, are we going to go 20 years without another large-scale foreign terrorism attack on our soil? I would not have put money on this many years without one. But we also supported rendition, detention, Gitmo, torture, right? Waterboarding. In our emotion in response, we, I think, lost sight of our values for a while. And the goal is not to do the same thing with domestic terrorism. It's to be very clear-eyed about how we approach this problem. And while we do, the head of the FBI has said we lost more people in the United States in 2019 to domestic terrorism than to foreign terrorism, which is an amazing statement for someone to say, given the investment we make as a government in foreign terrorism. That doesn't mean that the pendulum should swing so hardcore that we decide this is the boogeyman, that we must change our laws, our intelligence community structure. We have to be thoughtful about how we do it and learn those lessons. But, there are some organizations to call when that mom calls you in the dead of night saying, my son is going off the wrong path. They're just too few and far between.
What do we need to do about intelligence collection on the domestic side? I mean, obviously, we after 9/11, we turned the full force of the US government onto this issue of radical Islamist terrorism. Do we do a similar approach domestically now, turning all these tools that we've developed over the last 20 years on our own citizens? I'd love to get each of your views on that.
Well, I'll just start as the former CIA officer. I will just say we're looking at this in our committee. I mean, this is a part of our work is trying to understand how to right size and make sure one hand is talking to the other. But it is eminently more complicated when it is our fellow Americans who are the ones we're talking about. There are laws that are just different, but also, I mean, as a CIA officer, we were trained, it was drilled into us that we do not collect on American citizens. There's literally generations of intelligence officers who just give you the Heisman the minute you even start talking about that. So we have to be super careful that the agencies that are tasked with looking at this anyways, right, that have it in their mandate, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, maybe in a supporting role, the National Counterterrorism Center. Obviously, the DNI's office has to help us think through this, but I do not support DIA and CIA and everybody else just jumping in to look at our fellow Americans. And again, we have a very different legal structure when it comes to looking at domestic terrorism. If you have a guy sitting in my district who's flirting with Al-Qaeda in Syria or ISIS in Syria, the minute that guy buys a plane ticket and shows that he's demonstrating support for this organization, I can, get him on a charge of material support to terrorism. You have no such charge on the domestic side. So, and I think that's okay. I think that's all right because it is about our fellow Americans. So, I think we have to tread very carefully and make sure the agencies that have a domestic mandate are the ones reorganized and well-resourced to take care of intelligence collection on this issue.
Congressman Meijer, I see you're nodding along. You basically agree with what the Congresswoman just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking that this is an intelligence collection problem is really missing the underlying issue. And I'd actually love to get Elissa's thoughts on something on just how many parallels there are with the radicalization path or the susceptibility to conspiracy theories that, again, in and of themselves are not dangerous, but what they permit to allow in the world, how they reorient someone's conceptions of what is good and what is bad, and who is an enemy and who is an ally is incredibly dangerous. I would love to get Elissa's thoughts on how, looking at a lot of the folks arrested at the Capitol. I mean, there were individuals who had kind of multiple bankruptcies, many of whom were upper middle class, but it had experienced financial hardships, and those who had gone through substance abuse and had those issues as well. There are these markers where if somebody like that had a security clearance, that would start to get flagged and say, you could be recruited by a foreign government because there are vulnerabilities that they could exploit, right? A lot of the for-profit or for political power individuals who are exploiting them. And I was just talking to an individual last night who alternated between telling stories about, my grandfather who she knew, and saying that Trump was coming back and everyone who stabbed him and betrayed him would be hauled before a military tribunal and tried for treason. And then she ... Well, they get whatever the punishment is. I was like, it seems to me a lot like you're suggesting I'm going to be hauled before a military tribunal and shot. And she was like, no, well, like just how somebody gets to that point and what is permitted and allowed within that framework is incredibly dangerous. Much the same way that an individual being recruited by a foreign intelligence service is gotten to a point where betraying their country, betraying some underlying values becomes the logical framework, right? So just treating this, because by and large, I think that there is a risk from organized groups, right? And we saw this on the 6th with Oath Keepers and the 3%ers. We've seen this before with the Hootery and some others. Those groups are out there, but I think the magnitude of the challenge, it's more who the next Nashville bomber is, that is convinced of a 5G conspiracy, and that's why they're blowing up an AT&T communication site, right? Well, what happens when the enemy isn't just a network, but the enemy is a group of individuals, and that person, there may be warning signs, but even on the intelligence side, even the best of our intelligence capabilities is not well equipped to deal with that lone wolf, to deal with that atomized individual. And not only do we risk constitutional protections, but we also are not adequately addressing the problem if we think that's the solution. But I guess
did you want to react to that, Congresswoman?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's a strikingly similar pattern for people both abroad and at home who climb that ladder of escalation. I think it's strikingly similar. You have people of all economic backgrounds, but who are looking for community, who are looking for, they've got some sense of grievance. They've got something. I mean, even from the outside, you don't think they deserve to have a sense of grievance. They feel a sense of grievance, and they start finding, fellow travelers online. They start climbing the ladder. And then they start threatening online. Then they start threatening in person. Then they start, with a sort of desecration or graffiti, and it is really striking how someone moves up that ladder. Extremely difficult to interrupt that ladder, just having knowledge of it, but then also being able to convince them. But I think what we do see is that when people have opportunities, when they have their grievances addressed, then they often don't feel like they're going to risk life and limb and their job and their family and their home to do something. That's not everybody. There are people who attacked us on January 6th who had every advantage in the world, right? Who had every economic stability, all the economic stability they could wish. But there are people, and we saw this in the Michigan plot to attack our governor, who are looking for community, and they have a sense of anger and grievance, and they're going to act on it. There's not great history of interrupting that cycle, but it is important that we recognize it is a cycle. So this is why one of those things that's most important and is so small is like reporting this stuff, right? Just reporting, like if a swastika is painted on your sidewalk outside your house, report it. If you've got someone at work who is agitating and threatening another colleague, report it. And most people I know in Michigan are like, I didn't want to make trouble. It was a relatively small thing. No, the FBI will tell you we can't put together patterns. We can't address this issue if people don't report. And the vast majority of this stuff, people think it's below threshold, when in fact, you're in the middle of someone's ladder. You're catching them in like their ladder where they're starting to spray swastikas outside of businesses and churches, liberal churches, which is going on in my district. And it's like, you got to get to that person who's doing that before they go to the next level.
Have you done that yourself?
Climb which part?
No, intervened, like in the ladder.
So absolutely. I mean, we had a problem in my district about.
To be clear, I'm not accusing you of being on the ladder too.
Have I climbed the ladder of escalation? Not this week.
Let me rephrase. Have you?
I'm just checking. You're a hard-hitting journalist, Jonathan. So,
yeah. I'm not quite there, Congresswoman. Have you successfully because it is one of the hardest things to do. To successfully intervene in that ladder. Do you have a sort of story that you can share from your own life?
Well, I'll take two quick ones. One that was literally resolved yesterday, where a man kept calling and threatening myself and Senator Stabenow over and over again. 90-minute phone call after January 6th, threatening my poor 19-year-old intern, talking about wanting us dead. I mean, having an AR-15, talking about his weapons. 90 minutes. Luckily, I've now trained my interns and they recorded the entire thing. And the next week, he was caught brandishing his AR-15 at a local gas station about how the election was stolen, right? So because we kept talking about it and reporting it, and I kept banging pots and pans, then the law enforcement moved with purpose, and he pleaded guilty, and now he has 2 years parole and removal of his weapons, right? It's not perfect, but and it shouldn't have to be a U.S. Congresswoman. The one that I see that we dealt with in January and February was constant Zoom bombing of church services and community city council meetings in one of my counties.
And just for the audience, what is Zoom bombing?
So it's when you're holding a church service and suddenly 15 people you don't know start getting on your Zoom. You can't see their faces. In this case, they all had pictures of people, either the KKK or giving the Nazi salute. And they start attacking via chat the pastor saying, I'm going to rape and kill you for teaching about Black History Month at church. And of course, what do? You shut down the Zoom, right? We had this for some of our city meetings in our local communities. It just kept happening. And I had to go to those communities and say, please report, please talk about this. I'm seeing these 4 different data points. You just don't know you're part of a trend. Please let law enforcement help and report this. Those have, for the large part, stopped, but it's just an indication of like how this stuff has seeped into the meat of our lives, how it's filtering down. And the swastika things outside cafes and churches in my district, you got to report that stuff.
We've got about 4 minutes left, and I just want to give 2 of those minutes over to Carrie just to broaden this out a little bit, because we've had to change the way we think about domestic extremism, but also a broader array of threats handled by the Department of Homeland Security. We've got to think about it in a profoundly different way than we did in the post 9/11 threat of jihadists. Carrie, I know you've thought a lot about this. Like, in what are the most urgent ways in which the Homeland Security apparatus needs to change and evolve to deal with this broader and quite different array of threats than we saw in 2002?
Sure. So I think there's two different pieces going on. So one is addressing the types of issues that we've been describing in this conversation, which what Representative Slotkin is really describing is the disruption piece. And that is the bread and butter of what the FBI does in their domestic terrorism capacity. They have the investigative lead to be able to identify those instances and then identify the potential criminal violations and disrupt that individual, take that individual off the street or those individuals before they do the bad thing. And there's a lot of parallels from the international terrorism of the last 20 years or so and how that can be applied onto the domestic side, as long as it's prioritized and as long as it is resourced, and then obviously taking into account appropriate training to make sure that people understand when something is moving into the domestic terrorism side. On the DHS side, on the Department of Homeland Security side of things, I think we really are at the point where we need to be taking a really big picture look at what is the DHS of the future. On one hand, it has this huge law enforcement capacity that has built up over time. I'm not necessarily convinced that we need a DHS that looks like the Department of Justice with its heavy law enforcement and criminal investigative activities. Instead, a DHS of the future should be focusing on the things that it does best. What's something that it does really well? Well, it does national special security events well, protecting, taking into account all of its security capacities to prevent events. In my view, had January 6th been designated a national security special event with Secret Service as the lead, what happened would not have happened.
That's right.
The Senate staff report that came out this week discussed, on one hand, it said, yes, there could have been more intelligence reporting coming from the federal government, from DHS and the FBI. On the other hand, if you really read the whole report, there was a lot of intelligence information that was out there. There was intelligence that was put up by FBI Norfolk. There was intelligence that was in the hands of the Capitol Police. In my view, what happened on January 6th is that nobody in a position of leadership operationalized that intelligence. And so as we're thinking about all of the issues that we've just been discussing for the last 40 minutes, focusing on it only as an intelligence issue is kind of missing the bigger picture. What happened in my view is that there was a failure of people in positions of responsibility to understand that a political movement has become in part a violent political movement. And so we have to understand that that is a big part of what we're seeing here.
Well, I really appreciate all of your contributions. I mean, this was just a fabulous panel. For the audience, you're really not going to get three better contributors to a discussion like this, with the combination of authority to actually deal with these problems, personal experience, work with their constituents, and of course, Carrie's sort of big picture, long, vast experience on these issues. So, I've learned a lot doing this panel, and I hope everyone else did. So I want to thank you all for tuning in. And please stay on with Kate Kuzminski for the next session, which is called Military Recruitment for an Era of Competition. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.